Hey everyone, Nick Marzinski here at trappinglight.com, and today in this video I want to talk about a tool that's often overlooked in Photoshop but is actually a pretty powerful tool for doing any sort of alignment that you may need to do in Photoshop, and that's the Move tool, which is found up at the top of the toolbar right here, and it can also be accessed by pressing V on your keyboard. If you don't see this toolbar here, you just simply go up to Windows and click on Tools right here, and that will bring up the toolbar. So the Move tool, the one I'm going to be talking about today, is right up at the top. And one thing that I want you to notice before I really get started is that the options that are on this second row here are dependent on which tool I have selected in the toolbar. So in this case, I've got the Move tool selected, and you can see that the options relate to anything that you would do with moving, things like showing the transform controls, and then these controls here, which are grayed out, but I'll get into in just a moment. Right now I'm going to switch to the Shape tool, which is done by pressing U on the keyboard. And you'll see that the context dependent tools up here, options up here, change because now I'm working with the shape layer. So now it wants to look at, do I want the shape layer to be filled? Do I want a line around it? All that sort of stuff that's important when you're working with shape layers. So what I'm going to start out by doing is I'm going to start out by just drawing a shape. So I'm going to draw a circle, nice big circle like that. And I'm going to want to put a red line around it. And I'm going to want to make this red line really big. And not that big. Just a little bit bigger. That looks okay. Okay. Now I'm going to want to create a second circle. So I've done that with my toolbar, and maybe make this just a little bit smaller. Okay. Now, what I want to do now that I've got two circles is I want to take this second circle, ellipse 2 here in my layer stack, and I want to center it right within the middle of ellipse 1. Now I can switch to my Move tool by pressing V, select ellipse 2 here, and try and move it around and get it sort of centered in the middle, but there's a much easier way to do that. Okay? The way to do it is to select both of these layers, and to do that I'm going to hold down the Control or Command key and press and select both of them in the layer stack. Right now it's drawn a bounding box around both of them. With the Move tool selected, now that I have more than one layer selected, these controls here are no longer grayed out, and these are alignment controls. They allow you to align two different layers. So if I press this one, it's going to align everything on the top edge, or on the bottom edge, or on the left edge or the right edge. Because I want the smaller one centered within the bigger one, these are the two controls. This centered control here, which is align your vertical centers, and then I want to align my horizontal centers. Right now, both of these two ellipses are perfectly centered. So the smaller ellipse is right within the middle of the other one. If I want to center these two ellipses on this background, it's as easy as holding down the Control key, selecting the background, so now I've got all of them selected, and then pressing the vertical center and the horizontal center again. And now, just like that, I've got my image perfectly centered within my document. If I want to add a text layer by pressing T on my keyboard, I'll set some text and I'll write okay, and I'll approve that. With the text layer, you do have the option up here of left justify, center justify, and right justify, but those relate to this text box that you've got here. The left justify is going to align everything on the left side of the text box. The right justify is going to align everything on the right side, and because it's center justified right now, you can see it right here, everything is centered within this text box. That does not mean that this text box is perfectly centered within the document, however. And in order to do that, the easiest way to do it, I mean, you could simply just take the Move tool and kind of try and eyeball it and say, that looks pretty close to center. The easier way to do it is to hold down the Control key. Again, if you're kind of hopefully watching this getting a theme, select the text layer, the background layer, and then press the horizontal centers. And now you know that your text is perfectly centered within your document. So at this point, everything is perfectly centered in the document. The smaller circle is centered within the bigger circle and is also centered in the middle of the document, and my text is also centered right in the middle. If at this point I want to play with things, all I have to do is select which layers I want, move them up or down, and I'm just using my arrow keys on my keyboard to do this. And I have a lot of control, and it's very easy for me to manipulate these elements of my design without having to worry about, is something centered the way I want it to? Does it look like it's off or anything like that? By using the move tool and by using the controls that I have there, I have perfect certainty now that everything that I've done in this image is where I want it to be, is justified the way I want it to be. So that's one use of the move tool, and that's fine if you're doing design stuff, but for a lot of us, we're using Photoshop and we're doing photographic stuff. So how can the move tool help us there? Well, I'll give you an example. Here's an image that I took at Devil's Lake State Park in Wisconsin in early October of last year. And for the most part, this image is correctly exposed. There's good exposure here on this rock formation. The sky looks good. The background looks good. But this area here in the foreground looks a bit underexposed. At the same time, I've got this other image that I shot at right around the same time. I had my camera set up to bracket. And in this case, everything up here is blown out. It's way overexposed. However, this foreground, which was underexposed in my prior image, looks correctly exposed here. So what I want to do is I want to combine the foreground that looks good here with everything else that looks good here. And that's not hard to do, but if you look at the images and I switch between them real quick, you'll notice a problem. What happened when I took these two images is that I wasn't using a tripod, and because the brackets occurred one right after the other, I inadvertently moved, and so you'll see that this image looks a little tilted when compared to this image. If I cycle between them real quick, you can see how they're just off by just a little bit. And if I want to combine these images and make that effect look convincing, that's going to be a problem. So here's how to fix it. The first thing I need to do is I need to get these images on the same document. So I'm going to grab this image, pull it down off of the rack here, grab this layer out of my layers palette and drag it right onto this image. So now I don't need this document anymore. I can just close it. No, I don't want to save any changes to it. And with these two images on the same in the same document, you can see that they're off a little bit. You can see this bounding box here that's creating a little bit of a problem. Okay, now again, I could try and eyeball it, but because this layer 1 here is covering the background layer, it's going to be really difficult for me to eyeball things and make sure that they line up real well. Fortunately, there's an alternative in Photoshop using the Move tool. So make sure the Move tool is selected, and then I control and click on my layers in the layers palette to make sure both of them are selected. Now, I'm not going to be using any of these tools that are good for aligning here. What I want to do is I want to click on this button, which is an auto align feature. And what this does is it tells Photoshop, hey, look at these two images, these two layers, and try and make sure that they're all lined up together. And it gives you a whole bunch of different ways to do it. Generally, I found auto works pretty well. So I'm just going to keep it set on auto and then click OK, and Photoshop will do its work. And at that point, it aligns the image. And you can see what it did is that it tilted this front image just a little bit to make sure that everything lines up. So now, if I turn it on or off, there's no longer that shift between the images. What it did do in aligning it, however, is you can see these edges here on the edge of the document where I couldn't line up the edges. So to get rid of those, I'm just going to switch to my crop tool, crop in, crop in, crop in a little bit, and then crop in right here, and then click OK. And now I've got an image that's perfectly aligned and there's perfect edging on it. At this point, I can come in with a layer mask on this layer here, and I'm going to hold down the Alt or Option key when I select the layer mask so that it gives me a black layer mask. And now all I have to do is grab a brush tool by pressing B on my keyboard. Again, the context dependence here now it relates to brushes. I'm going to want to make sure that the brush I select is a soft brush, so it has a hardness set to 0. And this one's a little bit big, but I can just resize it using the bracket keys on my keyboard. And now, with my foreground color here set to white, I'm going to just simply start painting on this layer mask to expose the correctly exposed foreground elements from my top layer. And so now I've created a composite image, and I'm actually just going to lighten it up even a little bit, lighten those shadows just up a little bit right here. Now I've created a composite that keeps the best parts of this top image here with the best parts of the bottom image. So now everything looks well exposed on this photograph by bringing the two layers together, having Photoshop align them using that move tool, and then using a layer mask to correctly pull the elements that I wanted to keep from each layer. So that's it for this video. If you have any questions, please feel free to leave them either on my blog at trappinglight.com or on the YouTube channel. Again, my name is Nick Marzinski. Thanks for watching.